Welcome everyone to tonight's meeting of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee. Before we commence the meeting, I request that all mobile telephones are turned off or switched to silent. Thank you. Given the recent changes to the COVID-19 restrictions, councillors are able to be present for the meeting this evening. This meeting is being live streamed on the council website to enable the community to view the proceedings. Should technical problems be encountered during the meeting will be adjourned until the problem is rectified, or if needed, the meeting will be postponed. My name is Councillor Jim Park and I chair this committee. I'll start by introducing my fellow councillors and officers. Seated to my left at the horseshoe table, the Mayor, Councillor Gary Thompson, Councillor Susan Bigger, Councillor Cynthia Watson, Councillor Nick Stavrou, Councillor Felicity Sinfield, Councillor Wes Galt, Councillor Lisa Hollingsworth, Councillor Di Gillies, Councillor Jane Addis and Councillor Victor Franco. The officers in attendance tonight are the Chief Executive Officer, Philip Storer, who's seated behind Councillor Watson, and seated next to the CEO is the Director of Places and Spaces, Daniel Freer. Seated to my left is the Manager of Governance and Legal, David Thompson, and to his left, Elizabeth Manu, the Senior Governance Officer. Seated to my right is the Director of Urban Living, Sharan Wickramasinghe, and the Acting Manager of Strategic and Statutory Planning, Marjorie Kennedy. I'll introduce other officers in attendance as they present reports. Essentially, the purpose of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee is to deal with issues under the Planning and Environment Act and the Building Act. This committee has delegated authority to make decisions on behalf of Council. Councillors are familiar with the reports, which include a summary of the objections received. For those in the gallery presenting this evening, when we come to the agenda item, it will be introduced by an officer. I will then call you one by one to come forward and address the committee. If you're making a submission, please present your viewpoints clearly and concisely on why you support or oppose the planning application. Please don't repeat what earlier speakers have said and keep the submission focused on relevant issues and points not previously raised. If you are opposed to the planning application, please inform the committee why you are opposed and suggest an alternative approach which would satisfy your concerns. Please focus on your concerns rather than matters of history or detail in the officer's report. Note that there is a strict time limit of 3 minutes for each speaker, including councillors, and whilst as chairperson I reserve the right to vary that time, I seldom do. I will ask speakers to sit at the end of the table and I will invite those speaking against first, followed by those in favour. At the 2.5 minute mark, I'll make a sound and that will indicate that you have 30 seconds remaining to conclude your presentation. Apologies. Mr Thompson, have we received any apologies for this evening?
Through you, Mr Chair, there are no apologies for the meeting this evening.
Thank you. Item 1, adoption and confirmation of the minutes of the meeting held on 7 December 2020. Councillor Thompson.
Happy to move the minutes.
Thank you, and that's seconded by Councillor Hollingsworth. Thank you. Is there any discussion before I put that? Then I put that motion. Those in favour? Those against? I'll take that as unanimous. That takes us to item 2, declaration of conflict of interest of any councillor or council officer. Are there any such declarations? No. That takes us to item 3, presentation of officer reports. There is just one, item 3.1, 43 to 45 Studley Park Road Q, and that report will be presented by Kelly Caparosa, Senior Statutory Planner. You led me astray, I got it wrong. Thank you.
Through you, Mr Chair, I present UPDC item number 3.1 for the planning permit application PP 20/0163 for the land at 43 to 45 Studley Park Road in Kew. The proposal seeks to construct a 3-storey apartment building containing 12 dwellings over basement car parking. The subject site is located within the General Residential Zone Schedule 5 and is not affected by any overlays. The main issues associated with the application include: does the proposal appropriately consider the existing and preferred character of the area? Will the proposal have an unreasonable impact on the amenity of the adjoining dwellings? And is the impact on the existing trees acceptable? In relation to neighbourhood character, the subject site is located within the General Residential Zone Schedule 5, which encourages a diversity of housing types and anticipates for moderate change and housing growth. An apartment-style development within this location is consistent with the level of a change anticipated by the site's zoning and existing context. The proposal achieves full Res Code compliance and is supported by Council's urban designer. It achieves a high compliance with Council's neighbourhood character policy and is consistent with the existing and preferred character of the area. In relation to amenity, the proposal again achieves full Res Code compliance. Permit conditions have been suggested, which increases the proposed southern setback of the first and second floors associated with dwellings 9 and 12, where adjacent to the southern dwellings secluded private open space. The proposal exceeds the car parking requirements of Clause 5206 by 14 spaces. A total of 38 car parking spaces have been provided, which includes 2 visitor car parking spaces. A construction management plan has been included as a suggested permit condition, which seeks to minimise the off-site potential amenity impacts during construction. A suggested condition includes a construction management plan has been included, which prohibits access of construction along Thornton Street. Tree impacts and landscape design. The amended plans remove the pedestrian entries to Thornton Street. The proposal seeks to retain 3 canopy trees which are located within the front setback and includes a large Californian redwood tree. A tree management plan is included as a suggested condition. A landscape plan is included as a suggested condition, which recommends additional planting, including 15 canopy trees are proposed, which exceeds the replacement planting required. There is an alternate recommendation which introduces condition A to D and 17, and it is recommended that Council issue a notice of decision to grant a planning permit subject to the conditions detailed in the alternate officer recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillors, are there any questions of officers? We have no presenters on this item. Councillor Thompson.
Just a question, just to confirm that Thornton Street, which has a public and park and recreation zone running along the western boundary, there's no vehicle access off that site?
Through you, Mr Chair, there's no vehicle or pedestrian access, so it's noted that in the advertised plans, some of the dwellings had pedestrian access to that reserve, and that's been removed as part of the amended plans, that were the decision plans, and there's no vehicle access off Thornton Street.
Thank you.
Councillor Galt.
Could I just ask a question with regard to the air conditioning units? When you look at the roof plan, there's 12 shown there, so I presume it's 1 per dwelling, but there's only a 1 metre high screen running round those air conditioning units. Those units would be substantially higher than that. And I'd just be interested to see, that's not shown on the elevations. One would think it protrudes well above the roof level.
Through you, Mr Chair. As a consequence of the height of the building and the setback from the eave of that 3rd storey, 1 metre balustrade would provide both acoustic treatment but also in terms of visibility of a plant area from that distance at that height and that setback from the top level. It wouldn't be visible from the public realm. In terms of there being 12 it's shown as being 12 individual condensers, rather than a communal plant area. So had it been a communal plant area and on a plant platform, then we would have conditioned for a higher acoustic screen and visual amenity screen in order to remove those views.
I would be keen to see that demonstrated. Those units would be substantially higher than the 1 metre fence and probably would be visible from the street, but I'd like to see it demonstrated that it's not. And even at that, you'd think the screen would be shown on the elevation.
Through you, Mr Chair, that could be an alternative motion for you to put forward for it to be a condition to require further details on the screening to be shown on the elevations and the height of the plant equipment.
So that precludes visibility.
Yes.
I'd be keen to have that included.
We'll draft something like that now.
All right. Do we have any other questions? Councillor Franco.
I have a number of questions. I'll start with some parking ones. Firstly, why are we allowing car parking over and above the requirements? And are there measures where we do seek to reduce the car parking requests and take action in relation to that?
Through you, Mr Chair. There is a minimum requirement within the Boroondara planning scheme for the provision of car parking. A permit applicant can elect to... can everyone hear me okay? I have a loud voice. So 5206 has a minimum requirement. A permit applicant can elect to provide additional car parking. The instances in which we may condition for the reduction of car parking to meet 5206 rather than provide a surplus might be, for example, if we felt that the extent of basement was not providing enough opportunity for landscaping, which is not the case in this instance. The other instance in which we might reduce car parking would be if there was a traffic generation issue. For this proposal, with the number of spaces and the traffic volumes as provided in the traffic engineering assessment, it was not seen as a reason to reduce car parking. Thank you.
Just need to turn your mic back on. Yep.
Thank you. Do we impose restrictions on the property title for multi-storey dwellings of this nature in respect of their future entitlement to parking permits for on-street? And if not, why not?
So we provide a note within the planning permit which identifies to the future owners of the land that they would not be eligible for a parking permit, visitor parking permit, and that is also enforced by our local laws team.
I noted in the report that the car park area is open plan. And open plan car parks are of comparatively limited utility to residents by comparison with enclosed car parks. Enclosed car parks enable residents to use them for purposes other than simply parking their car. For example, if they have bicycles, motorcycles, scooters, other facilities, other storage. I know there's storage here, but certainly the amenity provided by properties where the car parks are enclosed are significantly greater. And I'm wondering, why can we impose it as an amendment here or as a restriction, or do we have anything in our local policies that enable us to do that or to push in that direction? And have we done so previously?
Through you, Mr Chair. The provision of storage is a statewide provision that is included within Res Code, or in this instance in BADS as well. So there is a minimum requirement of storage to be provided. In this instance, you'll see in the basement plan that in some applications there'll be over bonnet storage, which are in cages. In this particular instance, they're actually rooms which exceed the requirements of BADS and Res Code. So they are rooms that would be able to be locked and to store additional storage beyond what we would typically see for an apartment approval. So in terms of this particular proposal, it does exceed the requirements of the planning scheme. If council were to include a condition to enclose these car spaces to make them enclosed garages, it would likely require additional structural elements to be put in, and these car spaces do currently meet 5206, so it would likely, the basement would need to physically change to incorporate that. But moreover, there would be no justification within the planning scheme for us to include that as a condition, and therefore difficult to substantiate at the tribunal should the applicant appeal that condition. In terms of whether there is a local policy in relation to that, as I stated, it is a statewide provision and it's a particular provision, so it's not a policy, it's a design standard that applies statewide.
Another question in relation to the environmental performance of the proposal. The report reads and suggests that it meets all the energy efficiency requirements, yet we have significant large north-facing windows with no eaves. And as a consequence, if we don't take any action in relation to this...
I just need you to be careful that you're not straying into debate.
Okay.
And a reminder to all councillors that this is question time. If you're making substantive points or policy points, that the time for that is when we move to debate. Okay. So just be careful to phrase the questions as questions, if you would. Thanks.
I'd just like to understand the nature of the eaves that have been amended, or the nature of the recommendation for the eaves being inserted and the level to which they've been put in.
Through you, Mr Chair. So condition 1A of the alternative recommendation, which is currently up on the screen, it should read 500 millimetres. The provision of that 500 millimetre wide eave was actually in a response to neighbourhood character concerns with the proposal. So the officers felt that the proposed roof form was of more of a classical character response and architectural response, so therefore the eave was actually provided for neighbourhood character grounds. There is a condition 1L, I think it is, which is all north-facing windows to be double glazed. So in terms of that was the response that has been put forward by officers in terms of ESD for the northern interface.
Councillor Galt, you have a further question.
Look, I just want to, if I may, through you, Chair, just clarify my previous point. When you mentioned you'd asked them to show that screen and the air conditioning units on the elevation, does that mean it will come back to us, or it's simply a drawing exercise?
Through you, Mr Chair, so the way that the condition could be worded is it to be to the satisfaction of the responsible authority, the height of the screening, and for it to screen the air conditioning. So then when it is submitted as a condition 1 requirement to the planning officer, if they weren't satisfied that it would adequately screen it, they could ask for sightline diagrams, and they can also refuse to endorse the plans if it's not adequately screened.
At the risk of straying a debate, the question was raised because it could change the character and appearance of the building. If I could just ask a quick other question to do with waste disposal.
Sure.
And the bins in the basement. Is there, and I apologise in advance if this is described in detail in the report, what are the arrangements made for emptying those bins?
Through you, Mr Chair. So there is a waste management plan condition which has been included, which is requiring for this to be, it's going to be private collection. So rather than it being, you'll see that it looks like there's not enough bins, but that's because they're shared bins and it will be undertaken by a private contractor.
Collected in the basement?
So we don't have those details because we've required in the waste management plan for that to be provided. Usually for a development such as this, if we would need to see the size of the truck that's going to be entering the basement to make sure there's appropriate turning circles. If it can't be accommodated within the basement, there's usually a tug system, so the body corporate would have to actually bring out the bins. It's a long way, so they would need to demonstrate to us that the truck could come into the basement.
Thank you.
Now that seems to have exhausted the question, so I'm in search of a motion. Councillor Stavro.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I would like to propose a motion to accept the alternate recommendation of the officers and to add Mr. Galt's recommendation to provide the drawings for the screenings to the appropriate authorities' comfort.
Yeah, so that's the amended officer's recommendation, and with the correction of metres to millimetres in 1A.
That's correct.
And taking on board Councillor Galt's
Screening requirements for the air
yes.
conditioning
So
units.
we might put some words around that before we ask for a seconder. How are we going with that? Excellent. So just stand by for a moment and we'll get something up on the projector.
Chair, can I ask you a question, a procedural question?
Yes.
I have an amendment to the motion and I'm wondering whether I should put that now or after the seconding.
Well, since we've got some dead time at the moment while that some words are being put around that, would you like to verbalise that? I mean, you could test with Councillor Stavro if he's willing to incorporate it into his motion. If he's not, then you'll have to proceed a different way.
Okay. I'd like to add provision 1E, where you can see up there, to add provision of shading devices to all north-facing windows.
What's the officer's view on that? Yeah. Did you heard that, Councillor Stavro?
I think I have provisional, sorry,
I'd just like to add 1E, provision of shading devices to all north-facing windows.
okay. Thank you for that. Look, I'm not an expert on that, but I would, and have no objections. I'd hear the officer's way of approaching that, and provided they come up with some words that are acceptable, I'm happy to proceed.
Shall I explain?
Okay, I think the officers understand the thrust of it. We'll put some words around that and then we'll see if that addresses your intent and whether Councillor Stavro is then comfortable with it, and that might provide us a way forward.
Oh. He sent his emails to us.
Oh.
I'm looking at emails. It's from Marjorie. So it was.
Might just turn off your microphones in the meantime, if you would. I've got the order.
Through you, Chair, could I ask a question of officers on the
Certainly.
back of Councillor Franco's question?
Yes.
The merits to which Councillor Franco's suggested an additional item there with regard to solar gain, controlling solar gain of the north face, are officers satisfied that the design currently accommodates that?
Yes, through you, Chair. Yes, officers were satisfied the design incorporates that with the double glazing of the windows. However, there is nothing to be lost in the event that a condition such as what is proposed by Councillor Franco is included. It would need to be designed and it would go back to the designer, and we would then, once we see the design response, assess it at officer level.
So it's to the satisfaction of the relevant authority?
That's correct.
So I'll just give all of you a moment to read that. So the changes have been highlighted. Obviously, the change in C is simply a correction of a typo. Paragraph B addresses the matter raised by Councillor Franco, and paragraph A addresses the matters raised by Councillor Galt. So before I return to Councillor Stavro, can I just confirm, I imagine that addresses your concern, Councillor Galt, paragraph A?
It does, thank you.
And Councillor Franco, paragraph B?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Councillor Stavrou, just so we're clear, you, of course, can move whatever motion you see fit, but if you're comfortable with those amendments, then procedurally it's just less clumsy if it's included in your motion. But if you want to exercise either or both of those, then of course that's you're at liberty to do so. So if you can let me know if you're comfortable with moving the motion as it's displayed.
May I ask a procedural question just prior to that?
Certainly.
Yeah. So I would be comfortable. What I would like to understand is that if the appropriate conditions are already met and these conditions are put on the motion, is it really a matter of then satisfying the relevant authority to say that the current design, as it's been put through to the officers, meets those conditions, nothing else needs to be changed? They're just more clarifying in nature rather than adding an impost. I may want to rephrase that. What I'd like us to do is, if we are going to include motions, is to ensure that we don't add complexity, that they're there because they would have a proper and better effect to the design to achieve the community outcomes that are expected of us. So I guess what I'm saying, if those motions are included, a review would be had, and if the current situation or the current design satisfies those added conditions, we could proceed on that basis.
Through you, Mr Chair, if you need further clarification, let me know, but I think what I understand is that so the preamble, we call it to condition 1, all of these conditions are to the satisfaction of the responsible authority. So, for example, in terms of provision of shading devices to all north-facing windows, if the permit applicant were to find a different solution which would have the same ESD outcome as providing shading devices, the planning officer or council has the ability to consider a different option. All of the conditions that are put in here is to resolve an issue with the application, and we would need to be satisfied that that issue has been resolved. So for condition 1A, it would be ensuring that the air conditioning units don't have an impact on the streetscape, and B, that there's an appropriate ESD outcome for north-facing windows that goes beyond condition 1L, which was the double glazing.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And on the basis of my previous simplicity argument, then I think that I would like the motion to proceed with those amendments included.
Thank you. So that's the motion before us. I'll now ask for a seconder. Councillor Watson.
Yeah, happy to second.
Now, to assist Councillor Stavrou, is there any opposition at this junction? No? Councillor Stavrou. Speak to your motion if you wish.
There's nothing really else to add. I think that the only thing that I would add is that when large forms are proposed like this, obviously there's a lot of interest in the community, but having had extensive discussions with the officers, I think the great work that was done to ensure that all appropriate standards were met, and I also commend the extra car parks. I think they would actually be of a particular benefit, lighten up the burden in the neighbourhood potentially in the future. So all in all, I think really good outcomes have been had, and particularly I would highlight the outcome of keeping some of the existing trees in place. As I understand in some previous iterations, it wasn't the case. So I fully support and great work by the officers.
Thank you. I note the motion isn't opposed, but if anybody has a burning desire to add further, then I'll exercise that discretion. Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and thank you to the mover for moving. I'm glad we've been able to clarify that a number of the clauses up there have been included to the discretion of the authority, because I wouldn't want councillors to play designers on the run. So I'm happy to support it on the basis that that is now triggered by our officers actually doing some due diligence with the designers as we move forward. Just as a note, I'm having a look at the planning history of this site. It's had a number of iterations and attempts at actually getting up, and including a few failed attempts. So I think this application itself is actually addressing a number of the shortcomings of previous attempts, including car parking and those sorts of things. So I think all in all, a generally positive outcome, so happy to support. Thanks, Mr Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Watson.
Thank you. As the seconder, I'll be brief and say that Councillor Stavrou and also Councillor Thompson sort of covered off on a couple of the points that I wanted to make. Delighted about the trees, delighted about the extra car spaces, and I did have a level of concern tonight about what Councillor Thompson called design on the run, and was very, very concerned that we were creating an impost, but I'm satisfied that we're not, so congratulate the officers and being able to accommodate some amendments that are going to move this forward and not create another hurdle for this the development, which has had a very long history. So thank you. I support the motion.
Now that seems to have exhausted our speakers, except for Councillor Franco.
Thank you. I think the design is certainly an improvement. I'm very pleased to see the removal of the faux heritage, and I think that is quite an important step forward. I do think, and I'll just make this as a note and I'll raise it in general business separately, that we as a council are perhaps stymied by not having a local ESD policy, and I do think it's important as we see the design of residents across the municipality that we take into account, to the best of our ability, the future lifestyle and amenity of the people who live in the future building stock, and the imposts and cost imposts that can be transferred to future residents who may be unaware of the environmental impacts or performance of buildings. So I think it's important to take steps forward to care about their future finances, environmental lifestyle and sustainability of living. And I think it's important, especially as we see across the municipality properties with large north-facing windows without eaves. Anyway, I'll leave it. I'm pleased with the way we're addressing it.
Thank you. Councillor Stavrou, you have the right of reply. Would you like to exercise that at all? Okay, in that case, I will put the motion. Those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. That takes us to item 4, general business. Do we have any items of general business, councillors? Councillor Franco.
Yes, I'd like to raise ESD local policy.
The floor is yours.
Okay. As I read through the report for the meeting today, I noted a number of things. One, it seems to me that we don't have an ESD policy. Two, as I read the summary cover report, I noted that in the executive summary there's no reference to ESD. It is in the body of report we have energy efficiency, but it's not given sufficient weight as to be addressed in the executive summary. And I think that's telling. I mean, we do give weight to landscaping, vegetation, trees, etc., but not to energy efficiency. I also, in relation to this, I would like to understand, is there any work going into developing an ESD policy? Do we have an ESD officer to whom we can internally refer town planning applications and for response? Because it doesn't, from reading this, suggest that this is something that's happening. And look, I'll leave it at that, and I'd like to raise it from that, but I may have some further comments following on.
Thank you. Mr Wickramasinghe will address you on that. Thank you.
Thank you for the item being raised in general business, and through you, Chair. Councillor Franco, you're correct. We currently do not have an ESD policy. The council position fundamentally has been that ESD is important, but that ESD should be dealt as a single approach through Metropolitan Melbourne, rather than individual councils actually having their own individual policies. However, that hasn't been forthcoming from a number of complexions of state government, although I do note that DELP has recently been in contact with Council about preparing a roadmap for ESD, and that's something that's come up out of the blue, and we'll work with DELP on that matter. But putting that to one side, now that much of the heritage work at Burundara is coming to, if you like, a conclusion, at least in terms of the gap study. That doesn't mean there is more work to do. We have slated for next financial year the Strategic and Statutory Planning Department to actually prepare an ESD policy. So that is the intention for next financial year. Officers are actually doing a scope for that work at the moment, and in due course we will brief councillors on the scope for the ESD policy. So, and I think once we have indeed developed that policy, we will then need to look at whether we have an ESD officer. It is actually quite a specialist area in terms of assessment, and again that's a matter that will come forward to council about how we best approach the implementation of that policy.
Okay, thank you. That covers that item.
I just have two further comments on the comments that have just been made. Firstly, I'm pleased that work will be underway and will occur to develop a policy, and I note you said that this council has previously had a view that it should be something led by the state, but it is the case that many councils do have local ESD policies, and this council has been one that hasn't. So I'm pleased to see that that's something we're addressing. Secondly, I'd just like to make the point that if we do develop an ESD policy, that should be consistent with and referenced as well in council's climate action plan to the extent that that is developed. I just make that as a note.
Thank you. Councillor Thompson.
I'm just following on from that as well, and Councillor Franco's just touched off on a couple of things on that. I welcome an ESD policy that looks at our urban built environment. I think that would be showing good leadership amongst a number of other councils that are actually showing that leadership. So I look forward to that. Through you, Mr Chair, just a timing on that. Sharon, you said, or Mr Rick Ramasinghe, you said later this year. Is that correct?
The intention is to draft the policy next financial year, but we're preparing a scoping paper which we'll bring to council over the next couple of months for the policy itself.
And do you think this could run in conjunction with the climate action plan? Because it's a significant impact across the municipality.
I believe we can do that. I will confer with my colleague, Mr Frere, about how we can make that happen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any further items of general business? Then I'll move on to item 5, urgent business. Are there any items of urgent business? Item 6, confidential business. Are there any items of confidential business? Then I close the meeting. Thank you.